Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to do my best to keep this to about 40 minutes. And if you do have any burning questions as I go through, feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for discussion and questions. As Hannah mentioned, the Island Institutes has a very kind of diverse portfolio of programming that we do here, and our Sea Level Rise team is one of our newest teams, which may be surprising to you, but really for about the last year we've had a Sea Level Rise team focusing specifically on helping island and coastal communities here in Maine figure out how to grapple with this problem. And the reason that we have this team, just like the reason we have all of our programming here, is because we heard from our constituents that it was a need. So over the last few years, the number of inquiries we've been getting about the topic of sea level rise and coastal flooding and flood insurance and how it's impacting towns and people have been increasing. So as a result of that increased interest, we applied for funds from the National Academy of Sciences and were awarded a grant to build capacity in Maine. And so we've been working on that project now for just over 1 year. So I just want to provide this caveat that I am not a sea level rise expert of a long time anyway. I've done my best over the last year to become an expert, but I do refer in many places in my presentation to the real technical experts who have been working on this topic for their entire careers. And one of those people is Pete Slavinsky from the Maine Geological Survey, which is part of the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And then I also pull from some of the education that the Gulf of Maine Research Institute is doing. We work really closely with Gail Bonus, who's down there. She does a great public lecture on sea level rise, so if you find yourself in the Portland or South Portland area, that's another way you can educate yourselves or tell your friends about how they can learn more. So just wanted to give you a really kind of quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to start out with a little bit of the glacial geology and historic trends of sea level rise. We'll move on to global sea level trends, look at current sea level trends in Maine, where might sea levels be going in the future, what are storm tides and surges, and how is that relating to this topic? How does a community prepare, and what are some resources available, and what's the Island Institute's role? So I'll kind of get into more of what we're doing with this grant from the National Academy of Sciences at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to start by giving folks a little bit of background on sea level rise and kind of recent geologic history in Maine. I found it to be really interesting to know that if you look back 13,000 years to the end of the last ice age, sea levels were about 70 meters higher than they are today. That's about 230 feet higher than they are today. And then you can see, so basically this is thousands of years before present here on the x-axis, and meters above or below modern sea level on the y-axis. So 13,000 years ago, we're up here in like where the coast is in Millinocket. And then over about 2,000 years, you see this dramatic decline in sea level. And that has to do with the fact that the glacial ice had receded and the land is actually rebounding up. So the land was so crushed by the weight of all the ice that it rose up, kind of like if you push down on a mattress, that mattress kind of rebounds. And that's called isostatic rebound. And that happened here in Maine. And so the sea level actually, so in that period of glacial history was actually much lower throughout the globe, because much of the water was held tight in many glaciers. And so, but here in Maine it was actually higher because of the crushing factor of the ice. So as the land rebounded, the sea level dropped pretty dramatically. Well, it was 2,000 years, but looks pretty dramatic in this figure, to a point where it was lower by 200 meters than it is today. Or no, sorry, 60 meters or 200 feet. So picture it out somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean is where our coastline was. I have a figure to show you so you can visualize that next. So then really the driving force was more after 10 to 12,000 years ago, was really one that was similar to the global trend, which was of rising sea levels. And then over the last 5,000 years, the coastline has looked relatively similar to what it is today, and that's when modern beaches and wetlands were formed. So I just found this interesting to point out that over the last 20 years, Maine people lived along coastlines as far inland as, so imagine this being the coastline 13,000 years ago, so as far inland as Millinocket. And then 12,000 years ago, people living along the coast out, maybe not quite as far as Georges Bank, but out in the Atlantic. So what's causing sea levels to change? Well, a number of different things, but primarily volumetric increase of water. And so this is, what that means is basically the melting of land ice. So we're not talking about the melting of sea ice, because ice is already displacing water. So it doesn't really, when the sea ice melts, it doesn't really impact the sea level. But when land ice melts, that water ends up into the ocean and sea levels rise. You've probably heard a lot about ice melting recently. And so that's a big driver of sea level rise. The other has to do with thermal expansion. Basically, all that means is that when water warms, which is happening over the planet right now, and has been, it expands. So those are two big things. So imagine as the water molecules are warming, they're expanding, and that's contributing also to sea level rise, approximately 40%. Then there are these other factors like changes in terrestrial water storage, like groundwater, vertical land movement, ocean circulation, and gravitational drivers as well. So things like ocean circulation, interestingly, can have really local effects on sea level rise. I'm not going to get into it too much, but in the next figure, I'll just show you now. I'll show you like 2010 over here, this dot here. Is very high. So in Maine, this is Maine tide gauge. This is, yeah, Portland, Maine. 2010, that blip was because, according to oceanographers, there was a stall in the Gulf Stream there. So this is getting back to the ocean circulation changes and how they can impact sea level locally. A stall in the Gulf Stream actually caused water to kind of slosh into the Gulf of Maine, and created a kind of temporarily extra high year of sea levels. So, so in contemporary times, we track sea levels using tide gauges. And there's 5 tide gauges in Maine, south from Seavey Island, Portland, up to Cutler, Bar Harbor, and Eastport. I think I got that. Well, Cutler's above Bar Harbor, but anyway. So those are the 5 tide gauges, and that's the method that folks use to track tides in contemporary times. We don't have to look into like radiocarbon dating. We can actually see it on a tide gauge. And many of those gauges have been in place for over 100 years. So this is the tide gauge record from Portland, Maine. And basically, you can see it goes back to 1912, and this is through 2016. And during that period, you can see that sea levels are rising 1.85 millimeters per year. If you look more recently, you can see that sea levels are rising more rapidly at a greater rate. And that's the red line there, and that's showing you that between 1993 and 2016, sea levels are rising faster at 3 millimeters per year, or approximately 1 foot per century. So when people ask you, how do you know that sea level rise is really happening? You can say, we have the data from tide gauges to show that. So it's not something we're dreaming up. So this shows sea level trends in the Northeast. I included this figure to show you that sea level varies locally, and can vary, well, quite a bit locally. And so on the x-axis here, you have all of the locations of the tide gauges along the northeast coast, so from Maine to New Jersey, with Eastport, Cutler, Bar Harbor, Portland, and Seavey Island being in Maine. And this is the millimeters per year of increase in sea level rise. So if you compare it to the absolute global sea level rise, we know that that's about 1.7 millimeters per year during the 20th century. And you compare it to the rates of rise locally here in the Northeast. I'm sure many of you probably can't read these tiny numbers, but I'll read them for you. So basically, we've got rates from anywhere from 1.76 millimeters per year all the way up to 4.22 millimeters per year. So they're all just a little bit higher than the global average. Unfortunately, this trend of rates that are higher than the global average continues south of New Jersey, down the mid-Atlantic, and to the southern Atlantic coast. So basically, the entire east coast of the United States is seeing sea levels rise faster than the global average. And so I'm comparing that to the data from global sea level rise during the 20th century. These tide gauges, not all of them have been in place as long as the Portland tide gauge. So some of them are based on 30 to 40 years of data, but a lot of them are based on now 120 years of data. And that would, you know, the ones that have the bigger error bars here, they're based on a shorter time frame. So that would explain that. So what does it mean going forward? These are global mean sea level scenarios out to the year 2100. And what you can see is that there's quite a variability of projections here, ranging from 1 foot of sea level rise by 2100, which we're pretty much locked into that. There's scientific consensus that we're not going to get less than 1 foot of sea level rise by 2100, but the projections go up to 8.2 feet. The global projections go up to 8.2 feet. So these varying, the difference in the projections are based on the varying levels of ocean warming and land ice melt that occurs between now and 2100. But using more local data, so this is for the tide gauge data from Bar Harbor, we can see that the high projection is up closer to 12 feet by 2100. And the reason you can do this very locally now is because we have the tide gauge data, and NOAA has come out, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, that's the federal administration, the federal organization that maintains these tide gauges, and they have developed in this 2017 report regional scenarios for New England. So with much more localized data, unfortunately the projections are higher, essentially. So the projections, you can get the same projections. This is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers website. So if you're interested in projections for your local area, like if you live closer to Portland, you can go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers website, search for sea level rise calculator, and put in the tide gauge that's closest to you, and you can get projections for your local area through 2100. So usually, I don't know what you're thinking right now, but usually when people see these projections, they think, wow, what is that going to mean for my house or for my community? And we've probably all seen glimpses of what it might mean. This is the breakwater here. In this case, I'm pretty sure the Rockland Harbor breakwater was not designed to be underwater. And at some tides, it is. In this picture, it's not quite underwater, but it's pretty darn close. So if you're interested in seeing a projection for your community, tools exist to do this. There's lots of what they call map viewers out there where you can go to a website. In this case, I'm going to guide you towards some Maine-specific data through the Maine Geological Survey. So you can go to this website right here, or if you don't want to write that down and you're interested, you can just Google Maine Geological Survey sea level rise. I'm pretty sure this tool pops right up. And so just for an example, I went to the site, I put in Rockland Harbor, and then you have the option of selecting a scenario. For Maine, at this stage, the scenarios are highest annual tide based on 2015 data. It's not that different from year to year. What they're hoping to do soon is change it to be based on the astronomical tide, which is the mean highest tide over a tidal epoch, which is like 17 or 18 years, rather than the highest tide from one single year, which they'd have to keep updating this, which would be very cumbersome if they had to do this every year. But just keep in mind that the highest annual tide from 2015 isn't hugely different from this year. So you can look at what things look like just at the highest annual tide, or you can tack on 1 foot, 2 feet, 3.3 feet, or 6 feet of sea level rise. And for this example, I just clicked highest annual tide for 6 feet, and hopefully you can see the extent of the flooding here in Rockland. We're here at the Island Institute. We're safe. We'd be safe at 6 feet of sea level rise. Our employees who want to take the ferry home to their islands that they live on, not so much. They're out of luck. The ferry terminal is underwater. The ocean will be lapping at the door of the police station. So there's some substantial amount of terrain here and important infrastructure that would be flooded with 6 feet of sea level rise on top of a high tide. That doesn't include storm surge, which I'll get into a little bit later. So this figure shows 6 feet of sea level rise in Portland. And you may have seen images of this, the flooding on TV, or hopefully you haven't experienced it yourself, but it's not an uncommon occurrence in Portland. There's a couple areas in Portland, specifically around Franklin Arterial here. Whole Foods for some is kind of a landmark. Whole Foods Market is about right here. This is the intersection of Franklin and Somerset in Portland on a rainy day where there was a high tide. And then there's the Old Port here, which is extremely vulnerable. So again, this is 6 feet of sea level rise in Portland. And the problem with, this is the Bayside neighborhood, the problem with this whole area here, and actually the Old Port as well, is they're built on fill. So those were formerly wetlands. So it's not, it's not surprising that they're the areas that are going to flood first. And you don't have to add 6 feet of sea level rise to see flooding in these areas. From these pictures here, you can see that it happens at a high tide. The problem with, so it's not just coming up the coast and flooding things in the Old Port. In this area, it's actually coming, the ocean is coming up through the storm drains. So what people don't realize is that they're driving through salt water here. It's not flooding, I mean, it's in part exacerbated by rain, but it's salt water coming up through the storm drains. So this is a figure I took, a table I took from Pete Slavinsky, and it's showing the changes in annual flooding frequency with sea level rise in Portland. So it uses an average from 2006 to 2016 and gives you the existing number of times per year that Portland is seeing flooding. So the current flood stage in Portland is 12 feet above mean lower low water. And currently, Portland floods 9 to 10 times per year, which is about 1.3% of high tides that you see flooding. If you tack on 1 foot of sea level rise, you only need a high tide of 11 feet to see 98 floods per year. And then if you tack on 2 feet of sea level rise, you can see flooding 461 times per year, which is more than once a day, because 63% of tides, since we get 2 high tides per day, seeing flooding pretty regularly. So based on this, there could potentially be a 10-fold increase in the frequency of flooding in Portland with 1 foot of sea level rise. And what I showed you in one of those previous projection slides is that pretty much locked into 1 foot of sea level rise, whether we cease emissions or not. So we're going to have to prepare for more water. So this is a calm day here. You've got the lobster boat could almost be in the parking lot here. I think it's ironic that the sign says, "Please pull up." You wouldn't want to pull up on this day. So this is a calm day. This is not due to storm surge, this flooding. This is just due to a high tide in the Old Port. When you have impacts like Winter Storm Grayson, which happened on January 4th, 2018, then you have something called storm surge combined with the high tides, which really exacerbates flooding and makes things much more extreme. So this is a boat floating in the parking lot, much smaller boat. But nonetheless, not a good situation. So what is storm surge and storm tide? Storm surge, these are oftentimes confused. Storm surge is just an abnormal rise of water generated by a storm over and above the predicted astronomical tide. The storm surge should not be confused with the storm tide, which is the water level rise due to the combination of the surge and the tide. So basically, the surge might be 4 feet on top of a high tide of 10 feet, resulting in a storm tide of 14 feet. I just wanted to provide a couple examples of what storm surge can do, and this is a really kind of a unique historical photograph here. I don't know if you can read it, but this is Brown's Boatyard on Northaven, and the owner has been tracking some of the biggest floods. So this is the boatyard flooded during Winter Storm Grayson. This is the outside, and here's inside after the water is receded. That says February 7th, 1978. That was the blizzard of 78. That's like our 100-year storm. And this is another flooding event from 1997, and this is the red line here, or pink, showing the levels of flooding that happened during Winter Storm Grayson. So that's a high tide on top of storm surge, comparable to the storm of 78. Okay, so this figure here. Sorry for all the data slides, but hopefully they're digestible. This shows the top 25 annual water levels from 1912 to 2016 in Portland. I'm just showing this to show you how high tides in combination with big surges cause flooding events. And you have that 1978 event here was the biggest annual flooding, or the biggest flooding event in Portland since 1912. But like I showed you, that 1997 event in Northaven, it still made the top 25 in Portland, but it wasn't quite as bad. So it just shows you that, you know, the regional geography can influence how much water is getting into different places for the same storm. Fortunately, in Maine, we have a really high tidal cycle. So if the storm doesn't hit at high tide, we're in good shape. If the storm hits at high tide, not such good shape. So, which brings us to the ingredients of what one might call a superstorm for Portland. It's not out of the question. The ingredients would be a king tide, something like a record surge, which is what caused that flooding and the highest flooding event in the last slide. And the resulting water levels of 16.8 feet would be 2.7 feet higher than our historic storm, which is the 1978 event. And as I mentioned, Maine has been extremely lucky in the past due to its large tidal range, which lowers the probability of a large surge corresponding with a high tide. And this just shows you those ingredients over again, comparing the blizzard of 1978 on the left here to Portland, Maine superstorm that hopefully never happens. It would be a higher tide with a higher surge. So basically the point of this is just saying, yeah, the blizzard of 78 is kind of like our record storm, but it doesn't mean it is our worst possible storm. So all that is probably pretty daunting. I'm glad no one's walked out of the room yet. So how can communities prepare? How can you get there from here? I like this picture, not because it's at all a happy scenario, but I think it's kind of interesting to be looking at this. It's taken by the police chief of Phippsburg, and this is the road to Popham Beach. And it was basically the whole Popham colony was essentially an island temporarily during Winter Storm Grayson because the water just overtopped this road completely and it was impassable. So I live in Bath and I drive this road almost every weekend to go down to the beach, and it's hard to imagine not being able to access that area. So I want to provide you with a few case studies of communities that are taking action, and then share some resources about how municipalities can be taking action if they're not already using these resources, and then what role the Island Institute plays in all of this. So the first example that I want to share is Vinalhaven. And Vinalhaven's down street. They don't call it downtown because it's just one street. They call it down street. It is extremely vulnerable to flooding. This is the parking lot. This is Carver's Harbor in the background. This is the parking lot, and on this side, this is the down street. On this side of the street are all the buildings of Vinalhaven here. And this parking lot floods several times a year, several times in 1 month, according to Kate, who's a Vinalhaven resident back there. And some of the other buildings in the downtown are also flooding. This is the old Vinalhaven Theater here. And then even outside of the downtown area, there's roads like this that are made impassable by flooding, which occur, unfortunately, all around the state. You might have one near your house, too. Basically, this kind of came to the attention of the select board back in 2015 when people started to really complain about the flood insurance that they were getting hit with on their homes, or the inability to buy homes in the downtown because the flood insurance was so high. And nothing was really being done about it. No one was really thinking about it. And so they brought the topic to the middle school science teacher, and that really got the ball rolling. So I just include that in my story because it's really important to include the local schools, because the kids can then reach their parents, where in some cases the parents might not be reachable in other ways. So it's a great way to get the conversation started in communities. And so those school kids did a whole project on sea level rise and how it's impacting Vinalhaven. I think they even made gingerbread houses with, possible scenarios of flooding and various storms. And they made a video and they presented it to the select board. And from there, the select board, their eyes were opened. Vinalhaven now has a 7-person sea level rise committee, and they're, I would say, a poster child of community, really a small community, really taking action to figure out their vulnerabilities. And this is just a picture of some of the notes from a sea level rise committee meeting. They're trying to incorporate or keep sea level rise in mind as they're thinking through their downtown revitalization project, and include sea level rise in any of the capital improvement upgrades that they have to do. So they want to make sure that if they need to rebuild that sidewalk, which they do, that they're accounting for sea level rise and not wasting taxpayers' money by making it at the same level it is now, only to have it continue to be flooded. So other things that Vinalhaven has done is they've accessed money through the state through the Community Resilience Program, which is a grant program out of the Maine Coastal Program, which is now part of the Department of Marine Resources. But they have I think it's annual or every 2-year grant for up to about $50,000 for communities to hire someone, in many cases an engineering firm, to do vulnerability assessments. And so Vinalhaven applied and received one of these grants, and they hired Ransom Consulting, and Ransom did a really detailed vulnerability assessment of this Carver's Harbor area. So basically this picture shows one of the outputs from their modeling exercise. But these are the buildings on the other side so the parking lot is here. These are the buildings on the other side. There's a little, Kate, you call it a river that connects Carver's Pond with Carver's Harbor? Yeah, this is a tiny little channel, I guess it's a channel, yeah. Connecting the harbor to a pond back here. And as you can see, basically the downstreet buildings are getting hit from both sides. Now this is an extreme case. This is what they call the critical wave envelope for the 1,000-year storm event. So this would be kind of a worst case scenario. But Vinalhaven has a much better understanding now from a very scientific modeling study to show them what their vulnerabilities are. They were also awarded a DART site visit, and DART stands for Design and Resilience Team. And Bath, my hometown, also received a DART site visit. And the cool thing about the Design and Resilience Team is they're a multidisciplinary team, and they come to a community. They go through a whole community visioning process with community members where they basically understand the values of the community and what, in a situation like Vinalhaven, you know, what do they really value about their down street that they don't want to sacrifice? Or can you just up and move it to someplace else? Is that an option? Would that sit well with the community, or is that absolute last resort? So they come to the town, they do this visioning process, really try to understand the desires of the town and where the critical problems are, and then they provide you with some architectural designs of possible adaptation strategies. And they're really innovative. Not all of them are probably practical to do at this stage, at least not with a lot of fundraising. But this.
Is that through a state agency?
Pardon me?
Is that through a state agency?
The DART? No, it's through the American Institute of Architects. Yep. So they come up with some really cool designs. I know for Bath, I hope that one day we incorporate some of the designs they came up with, because it was really, really clever and well thought out. A lot of green infrastructure, so rather than like rip-rap and building walls, they try to plant trees and put wetlands back where wetlands were before we hardened them. So that's called green infrastructure. I'm not gonna have time to get into that, but that's a whole nother topic that I can provide folks with resources on if they're interested. So, so anyway, Vinalhaven has done a lot. They've really pretty much taken advantage of all the resources I think that the state has to offer, and now they're in the situation where they probably need to decide how they're going to pay for whatever adaptation strategy they want to implement. So Damerscotta downtown is a similar example. It's a much larger town, but similarly, their parking lot floods regularly. Again, this is a picture from Winter Storm Grayson. You've got the plow trucks plowing the salt water. And they've gone through a similar process with a different engineering company, Malone and McBroom. And basically, I know you can't read this, but this is the Damerscotta River. These are called the Narrows. This is going into Salt Bay. So this is Newcastle over here. This is Damerscotta, bridge in between. And this is downtown Damerscotta here. And for folks who have been there, this is the municipal parking lot here. And this is showing you what's in the flood zone is the blue. And then on top of that is 1 foot of sea level rise. And the red is 2 feet of sea level rise. So it's not given those projections, it's not like the high scenario. So it's a pretty extreme situation. And so Malone and McBroom basically came out with 2 recommendations. The town could either go and individually flood-proof each building, many of which are privately owned, or they could build a seawall in front of the parking lot. The select board is in favor of the seawall instead of trying to individually flood-proof every single building, because you can't force a private landowner to flood-proof, and so there would probably be a lot of, over time, lost tax base as buildings become unusable.
How do you determine how high to build the seawall?
That's a really, really good question. So I think, no, I don't think I have it written down in here. I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, the select board has decided to plan for 2 feet by 2050. So Malone and McBroom takes that into account and says, okay, if that's what you want to plan for, you need to build a seawall that's X number of feet high. I don't remember what the X is in that case. What I do remember from this story is that whatever the engineering company told them they should build, Damerscotta went to the town people, and the response that they got was, I don't want to build it that high because I won't be able to see the river when I go and sit in my car and have lunch in the parking lot. So, I mentioned that because you asked, and also because it just illustrates the point that public education is huge here. Towns can do a lot in terms of understanding their vulnerability, but in order to take it to the next step and implement some of these adaptation strategies, you have to have your citizenry on board.
Doesn't a seawall push the water
Yes, yeah, in some, so for Vinalhaven, a seawall wouldn't work. For Damerscott, apparently it would work because I guess the areas, and I don't know, this is me speculating, it would probably push the water to an area that's not as low-lying. So,
But that's not, Newcastle's not in the projections there at all, right? They just did Damerscott.
I think so. Yeah, this study is online, so you can get the details online. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of social equity issues when it comes to sea level rise, mitigation for private landowners. Like I've read about property owners in Florida who put up big seawalls only to have their neighbor bear the brunt of it. And so if their neighbor can't afford to do the same thing, then they're out of luck. Their property is going to be eroded or flooded. So some counties in Florida I know have made ordinances with minimum heights for they've somehow regulated the seawall building so that you don't have those kind of equity issues. Okay, and I guess so the last thing I wanted to say about that is just, I kind of already made this point, but so I would say Vinalhaven and Damerscott have both been really proactive, but they're kind of both in the holding pattern, trying to figure out how to fundraise to implement these strategies. So that's not to be ignored. That's like a huge problem for people all around Maine and all around the country. So, sorry for the text here. I don't expect you to be able to read it. I just wanted to make sure that people are aware. I've had some questions from people about how do I get my my select board or my town to care about these issues, and there are resources out there. This is the Municipal Climate Adaptation Guidance Series for Maine Communities. This is a lot to think about, and so basically the regional planning organizations, along with many state agencies, got together and put together an overview for these 9 elements that municipalities are responsible for. So basically, I'll read them to you in case you can't read them. Transportation, this is a huge issue. For emergency management, you know, when roads are blocked, that's a huge problem. Stream crossings, wastewater management, drinking water, stormwater, comprehensive planning, shoreland zoning ordinances, site plan review ordinances, and subdivision ordinances. So basically, each one of these topics kind of has a how-to guide for it to show the local towns how we can go about beginning to tackle this problem if that's our problem. Like some towns are in pretty good shape except their wastewater treatment facility is going to be flooded, which is a huge issue for human health and many other reasons. So I included that example because it's not sexy to think about wastewater treatment plants, but they're really important and oftentimes really vulnerable because they're built downstream of things usually. They're usually at the low point in town, which makes them one of the pieces of infrastructure that can be impacted first. So this is the step-by-step. So 3 steps of basic things that you could do. Use the most current and best available local data. So understand your local scenarios, do cost-benefit analyses for each scenario, and then think through the 3 basic courses of action beyond a do-nothing choice. A do-nothing choice is a valid choice and should be on the table. It just needs to be discussed. The other choices being protect in place, retreat and move the system, or retreat and consolidate the system with a neighboring community. And then be sure to do this, incorporate resiliency. This is like what they're really doing a great job of in Vinalhaven, is make sure that planned maintenance and repair are going to implement or take into account sea level rise, and investigate funding options for work beyond planned maintenance and repair. So how are we going to pay for things that aren't just in our capital improvement plan? And this one, we don't need to spend too much time on it. I just wanted to give you a case study of a wastewater treatment plant that has been, that is known to be vulnerable, has been assessed. I think it was the same engineering company, Malone and McBroom, who did an assessment of the Wiscasset wastewater treatment plant, and basically came up with, I mean, as you can see from, this is blue is the flood zone, this is the wastewater treatment plant here. You probably have maybe noticed it when you go over the bridge to Wiscasset. If you're coming from Rockland and you're driving south towards Portland, you go over the bridge and you look to the right. So the bridge is like right here. If you look to the right, you can see the wastewater treatment plant right next to the Sheepscot River. So I guess Red's Eats would be right here. That's a landmark. Look further down where the town buildings end, where the train track. These are the train tracks, and they go right by the wastewater treatment facility. So with 3 feet of sea level rise, these are their clarifiers. They would pretty much be flooded all the time, and basically the whole entrance to the facility would also be flooded. So it's a serious issue for Wiscasset. And the consulting company, again, has come up with some adaptation options, a concrete barrier seawall, or some examples of temporary flood barriers for doors, things like that. And then you can't see this, nor am I going to try to get into the details, but it's basically the adaptation strategies and then the costs, so that a community can kind of enter this discussion with their eyes wide open about the realities of what it would cost to adapt the treatment plant versus moving it, or versus going in with a neighboring community. Okay, how much time do I have left, Hannah? Do you know? 10 minutes. Okay, good. So the last thing I want to talk about is how the Island Institute has been involved in this discussion. And as I mentioned, we've been working on this in earnest for about 1 year now. And the first thing that we identified as a gap in where we could add value was in just bringing up the level of education for both technical experts and community leaders. So we held a symposium called Staying Above High Water, Helping Prepare Maine's Coastal Communities for Coastal Flooding and Sea Level Rise. We held it in Portland at the University of Southern Maine in late November of 2017. And the idea was to bring experts, technical experts in the field, together with community leaders so that they could better understand each other. So the technical experts could really hear from the community leaders about what they needed, and then the community leaders could meet some of these technical experts, and so they would know who to contact if they have a specific issue. For instance, we had someone who's a saltwater intrusion guy from the state attend and present on saltwater intrusion. So now Monhegan or other places that might have saltwater intrusion issues know who to go to begin to learn about how they might tackle that issue. So we covered, basically imagine like a whole day of talking about things like we're talking about in the last half an hour. And that's what this symposium was. We talked about coastal hazards. We gave an overview of map viewers, more than just the Maine Geological Survey one. Talked about FEMA flood maps and insurance. We talked about the impacts of FEMA flood insurance on real estate, which is becoming an issue and is going to be a real big issue. It's already a huge issue in Florida. We went through the Maine flood resiliency checklist, which I didn't have time to get into, but it's a really great way for communities to just spend like a day with someone from the regional planning organization in their region and go over how prepared. It basically gives you kind of a level of preparedness for your town, and it's all funded through the state, so it's free to the town. It's a great first step. As I mentioned, we had a saltwater intrusion expert. We got into case studies, like we had the town manager of Vinalhaven, Andy Dorr, who's been a real champion for this issue, come and present, as well as Damerscott leaders, and Booth Bay is another town that's been doing quite a bit. We talked about adaptation options, and we had representatives from about 6 of the engineering firms who do these type of assessments come and talk about where their strengths are and what type of work that they do. So towns, that's another thing that towns really don't have a great handle on, is who can we hire to help us. And so that was really neat. And all these presentations, if you really want more, you can go to our website and find all the presentations that were given. The presentations are included online. So you have this is a fact sheet we've created. We've handed this out throughout Maine to a lot of people. You have this too. This is the network that we do online to keep people connected and to make sure that folks know of what's happening. on the topic in Maine. And then this is just a picture from a leadership training that we put on in Ellsworth. This was part of our I Lead leadership training. And so we do leadership trainings on all sorts of things here at the Island Institute, and we held one specifically for community leaders who wanted to engage their citizenry around sea level rise and coastal flooding. And it was particularly targeted to towns that haven't really taken many steps. So it's not necessarily for the Booth Bay Harbors or the Vinalhavens or the Damascottas, but maybe the towns that aren't quite as far along as them, and basically identifying who some of the resources are in the state and how they can talk about sea level rise and in a way that people might care and listen. Finally, I just wanted to mention that we do have a mini grant available, and it is for technical assistance for communities addressing sea level rise. Some of the examples of what you might apply for or your community could apply for would be assessing the vulnerability of working waterfront infrastructure, local modeling of future impacts, saltwater intrusion, incorporating sea level rise into comp plans or other ordinance changes. That's oftentimes a first step that's relatively easy for communities to do. Or even hiring a consultant to write that grant application that your small town might not have the staff capacity to do. This is just one example. Monhegan, we've issued a Shore Up Maine technical assistance grant to Monhegan because this is the wetland below which is their freshwater drinking source. This is the harbor, and this is a saltwater stream that extends about up to this house on a really high tide. And just across the road from this house is their freshwater drinking supply. So with any amount of sea level rise, they're going to be really vulnerable to having salt water in their freshwater. So I just want to end here. I wanted to end with something that I found really inspiring at a conference that I went to on climate preparedness that was put on by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in New Hampshire a couple months ago. And this was one of their keynotes was how to find hope in all of this and how not to get too discouraged. And I thought it was really inspiring. I mean, she gave the whole 60-minute talk on incorporating hope into adaptation planning for difficult climate change problems. And her name is Dr. Susie Mosier, but I just want to read some of these in case you can't. They're really key elements to this whole process, I think. Doing it together, I think Vinalhaven has really exemplified that doing it together and communicating with the public is hugely important. Go in with clear-eyed diagnosis and with empathy. This is also a huge one. There are a lot of social equity issues around adapting to sea level rise, including who pays for these strategies? Is it just people who live on the coast, or is it the whole town? Or thinking about relocating, like managed retreat, if you actually have to leave your homeland, that's a big emotional issue. And so having empathy in these discussions is really important. Vision of a worthwhile outcome, a feasible path, a meaningful role for me, and a strategy when setbacks and goals aren't achieved. So I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to end on a hopeful note.